Welcome back to another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck. Today, we are in Howe, Indiana at the Howe Military Academy. I am joined by Commander Seibold right behind me, Colonel Tate, and Miss Eleni Metropolis. You guys, thank you so much for having us here today. And I'd like to start off with you, Colonel Tate. Talk to us a little bit about the military education. Can you just give us an overview?
Yes, thank you, Susie. Yeah, I wanted to just start off with just a quick overview because I think military education across the nation, especially at the prep school levels, misunderstood. But military schooling was established in 1802, with the founding of the United States Military Academy. And the academy was designed, the intent of the academy was to train young officers, young future officers, cadets as they were recognized then and they are today, in math, history, engineering, and other such subjects to prepare them, and of course military training and military art, to prepare them as young officers to serve in the common defense of the nation and to support westward expansion. And then in 1817, a gentleman named Sylvanus was the third superintendent at the academy, and he came in and as a real visionary, he standardized the curriculum across the board with three components or pillars that are still utilized today as a foundation for military education. And that's academic proficiency or excellence, leadership and character development, and military training and physical fitness. And what he did is he took those three and molded them, and with that and looking at that, to add on to that with an academic piece, he added ethics and philosophy, those types of courses to enhance decision-making, critical thinking, and the core values inherent to a young man and to a young officer. He also enhanced and standardized physical training, military training, and what was really key, and we're still using this today, is he organized those cadets that were just students or cadets into a military structure formation called a battalion. And a battalion has squads of 3 or 4 squads of 8 to 10, platoons, 3 of 30 to 40, a company of 80 to 100. And you take 3 companies, that's about 300 people, and you have a battalion. And up and down that formation are peer leadership positions where students are doing learning, leading, and as what's recognized today as experiential learning. They're right out there having to learn and in part being held accountable for their peers and of course for themselves. So those 3 components still drive military education today, whether it's at the United States Military Academy or at the prep school level at a place like Howe.
Commander Seibold, will you talk to us about the how and why the Howe Military School was established, and also why Northeast Indiana?
Well, back about 1833, a young man in New England heard the Go West, young man, go west, so he decided he'd come out here and see what was going on. So he decided to locate in what was then called Lima, Indiana, and he built a 2-room cabin and taught school in one room and lived in the other room and studied for the law. Passed his bar exam, became a lawyer, became a successful banker. He and his brother opened a local bank here in town that was here for many years, State Bank of Lima. And then he died in 1883 and left a bunch of money to he devoted Episcopalian guy, so he left the money to the church to build a school to train young men for the priesthood here in Lima or Howe. And then he gave some other money to the Anglo-Catholic Seminary in Nashotah House up in Wisconsin. So his widow talked to the Bishop of Indiana about establishing a school, and they talked it over and decided, well, it should actually be a grammar school. So they opened a grammar school in 1884 with 2 students and kept it going, and then in 1895 decided to make a little bit of change of direction. In the meantime, speaking to what Colonel Tate was talking about, the military school model that started in West Point was adopted by a lot of other schools across the country, over 100 at one time or another. One of these schools was Ohio Military Institute. They had a very devout Anglo-Catholic priest down there running that school, and Henry Culver decided he wanted to come to Lake Maxinkuckee and help him open a school there. So Father John Hayward Mackenzie came up here, went to work for Culver. They disagreed over a lot of things. And so after a year, the Bishop of Indiana, Bishop White, invited Mackenzie to come over here and look around, and they talked about it, started building some buildings. They built several of the old buildings that were built in the 1890s. This building we're in now was built in 1902, and of course it obviously is designed for Anglo-Catholic worship. So Mackenzie was here for about until 1920, then another priest took over until 1930, then in the mid-1930s, in the depth of the Depression, we got a civilian head who was here for 30 years. And so there was a lot of longevity. Mackenzie developed a very strong academic and spiritual tradition here, which caused a lot of people to decide to devote their life to the place. The key to the place's success for many years, including the time I was here back in the 50s, was the longevity of many of the instructors. They were pretty good, and it was pretty impressive.
Commander Seibold, can you talk to us a little bit? So Howe went through some changes, early on that really impacted the mission and the culture. Can you talk to us, because you were here in some of the earlier days, and talk to us a little bit about the history there?
Well, not in the 1800s, but the school followed the fortunes of the nation, as anything with longevity would. There was a financial panic nationwide in 1895, and that had something to do with the changes. There was a panic in 1920, which is about the time that Father Mackenzie died, so there were some more changes then. Then in the 1930s, it's the Depression. It's hard to keep enrollments up. They struggled and managed to survive, and this is when the civilian head of school, Colonel Boughton, came in. Then a real disaster came along in 1946 when the old academic building burned down. This put the school in a terrible financial bind, but they managed to fund a new academic building, build it, keep going. And then one of the great things that happened to the school was a Crest toothpaste commercial that showed little cadets brushing their teeth, okay? And this nationwide big deal. The school had obtained a very large gift from the Herrick family, the first of many. The Herricks gave a lot of money to the school over many years, and this caused new barracks to be built. The enrollment soared, and then from the 1950s on, it was prosperity for a while, and then during the Vietnam War, it wasn't.
Commander Seibold, the Howe is obviously known for its excellence, and at a point in time, the Howe cadets garnered some state and national recognition, both academically and athletically. Can you give us a little overview of that?
Well, we'll start in the late 1940s. Howe had an extremely active speech program, of which I was part, and we won a lot of prizes. We sent people to the national speech competitions almost every year, which you had to do by winning state in Indiana. We had the largest National Forensic League chapter in the state by lots because, see, back in those days it was before Howe was co-ed, and so if you went to a speech meet on the weekend at some other high school, the big difference was there were girls there. And so all of a sudden there were a lot of cadets interested in the speech program. So we did very well. We had some stellar athletic teams. We won a sectional championship in basketball, beating Kendallville by 1 point in overtime. This was very dramatic in the late 1940s. We always had a very powerful rifle team here. The rifle team won a big rifle shooting thing called the Hearst Trophy several times. We were number one nationally in the Hearst competitions, number one in several Fifth Army, which is what Howe was in at that time, competitions, and so we did quite well. Basketball, football, not so much so. In the early part of the 20th century, we had some pretty strong football teams, but Howe was a small school playing much bigger schools, and so it was a challenge.
Colonel Tate, this next question is for you. So in the late 60s, early 70s, enrollment really began to drop. And, unfortunately, just the desire overall to attend military schools at that time. Can you talk about the decline there and why?
Sure, thank you. I think that kind of to add on, to amplify what the commander stated, when you just look at the nation's history and look at the 1900s, okay, we went through we fought through 2 world wars, the Korean conflict, and the nation went through a lot of hardship, but the nation was unified. There was a real unity of of effort there. And the values that were shared across the nation tied back in, to I think the political, military, social, and economic construct of our nation. And people had a trust, a trust in our leadership and in our nation. And as then we progressed into the 60s, we got into a very, very unpopular war in Southeast Asia. And that war, for the first time, it not only was unpopular, and it was, a splintering to the nation. It was certainly associated with the military, but I think more than anything, mass media and mass communications brought this frustration into everyone's living room. People could visibly see the pain, the suffering, and when you're not committed, and then you see loved ones, and you see a nation at war, and unfortunately, there's a lot of things that go into this that we won't discuss here, but I think people also, through this movement, there's a real cultural movement, in our country at that time, and along with the Vietnam War, there was civil rights and movement and women's rights and Title IX, and all of this was coming into play, and I think a lot of the students and parents were really starting to look at different options for education, and unfortunately, anything that was associated with military became quickly unpopular. Okay, and with all of that, then, when you look at this, and then as we progress, we've had this same type of challenge. We never at the prep school level have really recovered from that. Okay, at the military colleges and universities, very much so, with the surge in nationalism in the early 2000s, et cetera. But I don't think the prep schools have really recovered from that. And a big part of that now is we have so many options for education. We have online learning. We have very specific independent schools for athletics, for STEM, on and on and on. And when 3% of the country, basically 3 to 4% of the students in the country are involved in independent education, there's just a lot to choose from, a lot to deal with. And that's the case here at Howe. And I think it's important to note specifically at Howe as we transition, there's a tremendous amount of overhead. A military education, as we talked about with those 3 pillars, it's absolutely tremendous. But, small classrooms, sometimes less than 10 students to an instructor, the overhead with the athletics, with the maintenance, with the facilities, with the finances that go with supporting such a school and a high-end staff, that, we here at Howe, after 135 years, are forced to close our doors. And it's really sad when, right now there's less than 40 military schools, and they're closing at a rate of one per year.
Ms. Metropolis, when were females admitted here to Howe? When were they first admitted?
So the first female boarding students at Howe were here in 1988.
Okay. And so how'd you get to Howe?
Yeah. So actually my stepdad, Jim Weiss, was in Fred's class. In 1953, they graduated. But anyway, so he was born in Howe, raised in Howe. His father was the quartermaster. His mother washed laundry for all the cadets just so that Jim could come to school here. And he graduated, like I said, and was very active in the Alumni Association and the Board of Trustees, and just a big donor to Howe as well. So he was very involved. And when it came time for me to figure out high school, I toured Howe, and I fell in love with the campus. I was really excited about just the prospect of coming here, and I eventually came in 7th grade, so I was here for 6 years, and I guess that's what brought me here, my stepdad.
So you had a great experience here. I would love for you to be able to talk about how that experience has benefited you throughout that, at that point, and then throughout time.
Sure. It's really hard to condense like my whole experience into like 2 minutes, but I guess I would say my experience at Howe really set me up for my future in college and professionally. I was able to do things at Howe that I don't think most people were able to do because of time management and the discipline and the leadership skills that we learned here. But I I was in band and choir, and I played sports, and I was on the editor of the newspaper, and I did all this stuff. And, I know it's not about me and what I did here, but I think it's a good example of like the type of people that Howe produced. Yeah, exactly. And so after I left Howe and I went to college, they gave me a huge scholarship just for going to Howe. It was amazing. But I would look at my college peers and I would see them not struggling, but just kind of, getting adjusted to college life. And because I'd lived in the dorms for 6 years, I was already adjusted. So I was able to excel in college and graduate early. And I owe everything that I've become to Howe and just that foundation that I learned here.
Okay, so what I know of you is that today you are a naturopath, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Which you can explain that a little bit, but you've done some other very interesting things even before that, and so I don't want you to shortchange yourself. Please expand.
Okay, so for a small amount of time, I worked as an editor for a newspaper. And then I worked as an IT. So actually, I should rewind a little bit. In college, I ended up making my own major, and so that was like really interesting and weird. So
what was that major again?
Journalism, chemistry, computers, and music.
Yeah, because that happens.
I don't know. It's weird. I know. So basically, I just had like a lot of different jobs. I worked in IT for the Detroit Tigers for a little bit, and then I became a business owner and started doing signs and graphics and brochures. And then I went to naturopathic school, and so I'm just kind of all over the place. But I think that I'm able to balance all of that and learn how to kind of compact everything, and my time management and all of my business skills and speaking, professionally and all of that. It all comes from Howe, and I say that all the time. And I'm not just saying that because we're on this interview right now. I say it constantly. It's all due to Howe. So,
when most people think about military schools, I believe there's a male dominance that gets associated with that. Mm-hmm. So, as a female, how did you handle that?
Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting question. I think since females started about exactly 10 years before I came here in '98, it was still, there were still a lot of male dominated things. Like I wore men's clothing, and I'm not ashamed to say that I did that for 6 years, but it was just part of the uniform. But all jokes aside, I really do think that the women and the female cadets that were at the school at the time really learned how to kind of like pave their own way, but also to mesh with the male cadets as well. So there was this kind of like, I guess, transition for the male cadets to learn how to kind of take orders from females, but also I think the females had to learn how to be kind of strong and be able to command a corps of cadets. So
yeah, and I think if she would, Susie, 3 weeks into the school, we have what we call a cresting ceremony, and the rocks, as we call them, our recruits on campus or whatever. They come in, they've gone through 3 weeks of training, and they've learned all the basics of being a Howe cadet. And we have a ceremony and a parade, and we ask Eleni to be our cresting ceremony speaker. And of course, she was more than happy and flattered to do it. And she provided an interesting story to the cadets about her year, or her selection as the battalion executive officer, which is number 2 person in charge of the Corps cadets, in lieu of the battalion commander, which is the number 1 person in charge of the cadets, and a position that she was really pursuing. So I'd like her to talk to that.
Yeah, I have a feeling that's going to be a good story, maybe even a little humorous and humbling, hopefully.
Exactly. It's definitely humbling. You got it, Susie. Yeah, so my best friend and I, obviously she was a female, we went through Howe together, all 6 years together, and we were neck and neck and just really enjoyed, friendly competition. And it became time to, junior year, we all wonder, what's our position going to be next year? Who's going to be battalion commander? It's all kind of like nail-biting kind of stuff. And lo and behold, she got battalion commander. And I spoke about this in the cresting ceremony because it was a difficult thing for me to accept at the time, but I understood that just because you are excelling at something doesn't mean that you're always going to be at the top, but you have to learn how to manage being second is okay, and there's different reasons why that happened, and I was able to kind of like take that experience and transition that, I guess I would say, kind of move that into my professional career. And just while I still continue to make goals and I set records and I do things, it's okay to fail sometimes, because I think at Howe we're all just very goal driven and very like, we got to do this, and we all exceed, and we're successful in doing those things. But sometimes you get a little kick in the butt, and it's okay.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but I'm just like she's talking about second place and that's a fail. I'm like, I don't see how that's, but okay, no, but I absolutely understand, and if that is something, that drive in you is absolutely something that this place has helped produce. That makes sense to me.
And I want to just add to this. She and I were the very first. She was the first female battalion commander, which congratulations to her. And then I was battalion executive officer, so we were number 1 and number 2 first in the history of Howe. So you know what? Yeah. We still got that.
That's history. You made history. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Commander Seibold, with Howe being so steeped in its history, can you talk about some of the buildings on campus, some of the historic features?
Well, we're in the St. James Chapel, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. Built in 1902, the school chapel for a long time, until the school expanded. This building was too small for the Sunday masses. All Saints Chapel was then built so it could accommodate the larger Corps of Cadets. The school has still held services in here up until the very last service alumni weekend that I attended in here, so it's been in use. Of course, the barracks kept pace with the growth of the school. The school had a problem with the old barracks that were built around the turn of the 20th century, because although they were brick veneered, they were wood inside. The fire marshal didn't like it, so we had to have new barracks. Just about the time I was leaving the school, the Herrick family gave the money to build new barracks, and the barracks were built and added to as the school cadet population grew through the 1960s. The new academic building was built while I was in school. In fact, we were my sophomore year was the first year we were in the building. The old academic building had burned down in 1946. The school had trouble raising money to build a new building, but they built it, and we had a first-class facility when we were here. It's a beautiful building, but of course it's now not a new building anymore. It's an old building. And so it goes on. The tradition is passed down. You can look at old pictures in here that are 100 years old of the long gray line lined up in the pews, and the traditions come down the line. Eleni is wearing a medal that Mrs. Howe, it's one of her gold medals that Mrs. Howe gave to a cadet around the turn of the century for an award. One of my classmates, George Dallas, was the battalion commander my senior year, and so he thought Eleni was sure to be battalion commander, so she carried his sword all these years later after he graduated. Okay, his saber, I mean. So the tradition goes down the line, and it has right up to this time.
Wow. Great story. Tom, did you want to elaborate on that?
No, I'd like Fred just to go ahead very quickly and talk about the mansion as well, because I think along with St. James, the mansion those are the two iconic features of Howe Military Academy.
Yes, after Mrs. Howe died in the early 1900s, the head of the school, which was the rector, or Colonel Boughton, the colonel, lived in that. That was the head of school's residence. And then later on it was converted to an administration building, and then it was restored back to being an old late 1800s mansion. When it was originally built, there wasn't any such thing as running water, so there was a water tank in the attic so that you could actually have flush toilets and basins in the building without having to go out to the well and pump it in a pitcher. And so Mrs. Howe had teas there. The guy who was a business manager when I was in school here waited tables for Mrs. Howe at her teas in that mansion. The mansion's on the National Register of Historic Places. It, like any over 100-year-old building, 1872, needs work, but it's been preserved and it's there, and it's a way to go all the way back in the past to 1872 and see how a successful banker lawyer would live back in the day.
Back in the day. I also remember a story about Mrs. Howe having the windows open so that she would be able to.
Well, every year we observe a holiday in the school called Mrs. Howe's birthday. I'm going to say it was October 21st, but my memory's fading. So at the time Mrs. Howe was dying, the choir was having choir practice in here, and the windows were open, and they were singing a hymn out of the Episcopal hymnal, and Mrs. Howe sent word over that she wished they would keep singing. So they kept singing it, and Mrs. Howe passed away, and so every year in commemoration of this, the school celebrates Mrs. Howe's day, but it was actually the day she died.
Commander Seibold, it is very clear to me that you have extensive knowledge and a passion for the military academy here. But what makes you most proud when you think about Howe?
Well, I'm proud of my parents for making the sacrifices to send my brother and I here. They were small-town business people, and it was a stretch for them, but they believed in the school. They believed in the religious side of it, and my father certainly believed in the military side of it. And I went through Howe and was very active in the speech program and walked directly into a Navy ROTC scholarship right out of the Howe speech program. Boom, 4 years of college paid for, free ride. I can't beat it, okay? And so, as you know from watching this video already, Elenia and I have the same story generations apart. She walked right into a college scholarship, and so did I after going through Howe. Pretty neat.
Ms. Metropolis, how do you believe that the legacy of Howe is going to be lived on for years to come?
That's a really good question. It's a little bit of a conundrum that we're in, because now that the school is closing, how do we move forward? And so I think a lot of people are asking that same question. So I would just really like to say that Fred, as the president of the Alumni Association, and myself as the vice president of the Alumni Association, would just really encourage people to continue to donate to the Alumni Association and be a part of that association if they're an alum. And if not, look at our website, hmsalumni.org. And just to be able to keep in touch with us. We're still going to do alumni weekends, and we're still going to try to preserve as many memories from memorabilia from the campus as possible. And I'm personally very involved in that process. So I guess just making sure that everything is the way that it is, just off campus, and we're very dedicated to doing that.
I know.
For people who want more information, two very good books have been written, one about Howe and one about military schools in general. The Howe book is a 100-year history of Howe by Raymond Kelly, who was a headmaster for a long time and superintendent. And the other one was by a gentleman named William Truesdale, Trousdale, and it's a story about military high schools in the United States. It's a very well-researched sociological study, actually, and there's a lot of stuff in there.
Colonel Tate, do you have any closing comments?
Well, first, I would like to thank you two folks in history in your own backyard for coming up once again and making this possible today. We really do appreciate it very, very much. Before I thank some folks, what I'd like to do too is just kind of once again look at the three pillars of academic excellence, leadership, character development, physical and physical training within a military structure. Okay, and you're looking at two alums here on my left and right. One, let's just say, somewhat senior to the other. One male, one male, one female. And folks from different backgrounds, different backgrounds, different stance, social stance. But when they come here, they're Howe cadets. They leave as Howe graduates with those values that we've talked about that they are focused on from 1802 forward, and with a component of true faith and honor that's within their hearts and will be there for forever, for years to come, and for a lifetime. And and I think that just the way they've communicated and exhibited communicated their experience here today, pretty much punctuates that statement. The other thing I'd like to do is I'd just like to thank over the years all the benefactors, all the alumni, all the students, all the parents, faculty, staff, friends of the academy, or the school as it was called several years ago, for their their generous support. I mean, their generosity has just been absolutely overwhelming over the years, and what they've done to contribute to an educational method of formation that I think is absolutely second to none, and has developed thousands of young men and women and put them on a path to success.
Thank you for watching another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck. Today we are in Howe, Indiana, here at the Howe Military Academy. Remember, travel slowly and stop often. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.